I've never been one to go to company parties. Always thought they were kinda awkward, you know? Everyone trying to be friends, laughing at the boss's forced jokes. Not my thing. But that year, things were a little different. I had just been transferred to a new department and barely knew anyone. That's when Clark, the super chill guy who sat next to me, invited me to a casual hangout with the team. He sounded so excited about it that it felt more like one of those parties where everyone loosens up, no formalities. I'd been in the city for a little while, didn't have many friends, so I thought, why not? The party was on Friday night, at a house outside of town that Clark swore belonged to one of the managers. The place looked like one of those mansions rented for events, and when I got there, the house was all lit up with some background music playing. There were a lot of cars parked outside, which gave me a sense of normalcy, nothing too weird so far. When I walked in, I was greeted by a few people I didn't recognize, but I figured they were from other departments or something. The company's big, so you can't know everyone. But as time went on, I started noticing something strange. It seemed like everyone knew me. And not in a casual way, but like they knew personal things, stuff I'd never told anyone. At first, I tried to brush it off. People would come up to me, calling me by my name without me even introducing myself, and they'd make comments that seemed kinda generic at first. Stuff like, "So, you like your coffee strong, huh?" Or "Working with numbers must be exhausting, huh, Mark?" I'm a financial analyst. I figured maybe Clark had mentioned these things. But the conversation started getting more specific. A woman, who said her name was Isabella, brought up my favorite band, one that only my closest friends know I'm into. Then another guy, whose name I didn't catch, made a comment about my dog, Thor, even mentioning the kind of toy he prefers. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I looked around for Clark in the crowd, but I couldn't find him. The music, which had been a calm background, now sounded louder and disjointed, like every instrument was playing a different rhythm. I grabbed a glass of wine to try to calm my nerves, but my hands were so sweaty I almost dropped the glass. Meanwhile, every interaction just kept getting weirder. An older woman came up to me and said, "You should be careful on the roads at night. After all that happened last summer." That froze me right to the bone. Only I knew about the car accident I almost had back then. It was something I'd never mentioned to anyone. I decided I needed to leave, but I didn't want to make a scene. I headed down the hallway towards the back door, but as I walked, I noticed some guests started staring at me. Not in a casual way, but like they were sizing me up. The smiles that had seemed friendly at first now felt forced, almost predatory. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. Maybe it's all just a coincidence, I thought, but it was hard to ignore the stares. When I finally got to the door, it was locked. Not just locked, but it had a heavy bolt, the kind you wouldn't expect for a casual party. I went back to the main room, trying to keep my composure, and decided to find a room where I could call a cab or at least send a message. My phone, which had been in my pocket up until then, had no signal. That was already strange in itself because I remembered checking my notifications when I arrived. When I went into one of the rooms upstairs, I came across something that nearly made my heart stop. On the bed, there was a pile of papers. Pictures of me, newspaper clippings about me, and even copies of old emails I was sure were in my personal account. How had they gotten there? I started shaking, feeling the weight of something I couldn't comprehend. I froze, staring at that pile of personal information as if I were facing a bomb about to go off. Every detail of my life was there. There was even a black and white photo from my childhood that I didn't even remember existed. I started going through the papers, trying to find any clue of who could have done this, but what I found made me even more disturbed. One of the documents had a list with exact dates and times, marking events from my routine, things as simple as coffee at 8 a.m. at the Central Market or run in the park at 7 p.m. It was like someone had been watching me for a long time. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and as a reflex, I turned off the light and hid behind the door. The sound stopped right in front of the room. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing through the entire house. The doorknob slowly turned, and I held my breath, hoping the person wouldn't come in. But instead, I heard a low voice, almost a whisper, saying, "He's here. He's already found his stuff." It was Clark's voice. My muscles tensed, and all I could think about was one thing: how to get out of there before it was too late. After the footsteps faded away, I crept out of my hiding spot as quietly as I could. Every move seemed louder than it should have, and the feeling that someone could come back at any moment suffocated me. I looked out the window, trying to figure out if it would be safe to jump. It wasn't a very high fall, but the ground below was made of stones. If I twisted my ankle or something, I'd be even more vulnerable. Even so, I felt like it was my only chance. I slowly opened the window, the cold night wind hitting my face like a slap, and I prepared to climb out when I heard a low, unsettling sound: laughter. A lot of laughter, coming from different directions in the house. The laughter echoed through the hallway and the main room, but it wasn't normal. It sounded mocking, almost synchronized, like everyone was sharing the same twisted joke. I could clearly hear Clark among them, laughing with an intensity that gave me chills. Suddenly, the house lights flickered and went out. My instinct screamed that I didn't have much time left. I slid over the edge of the window, my fingers gripping the cold wood as I tried not to look down. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I heard a screeching sound from inside the house, like a scream mixed with a metallic groan. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I started running, ignoring the pain in my knees as I stumbled awkwardly. As I ran through the garden, I noticed that there were no more cars parked. All the vehicles I had seen when I arrived had simply disappeared. I looked back and saw the house, now completely dark except for one light still on in an upstairs room. For a brief moment, I swear I saw a silhouette in the window, standing still, watching me. My heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. The laughter still echoed, though distant now, and the sound seemed to follow my every step. I didn't know where to go, I just knew I needed to get as far away from that place as possible. After running for a few minutes, I reached a poorly lit dirt road. That's when I saw something that made me freeze: Clark, standing under a street lamp, staring at me intently. He didn't say anything, didn't try to stop me, but there was something in his expression that felt deeply wrong. He looked satisfied, as if everything had gone exactly as he'd planned. I didn't wait to find out what he would do next, and I kept running. My phone, which had no signal before, suddenly started vibrating in my pocket. When I looked, there were dozens of unread messages, all from unknown numbers, with short, unsettling phrases: "Don't look back, they know, it's just beginning." Ignoring the messages on my phone, I continued running down the road. Each step felt heavier, as if something invisible was pulling me back. The air felt thick, heavy with an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of my own feet pounding on the dirt ground. At some point, I saw lights in the distance, maybe a village or a safe place. Hope gave me a burst of energy, and I ran as fast as I could. But as I got closer, I realized the lights weren't coming from houses or street lamps, but from a circle of lanterns arranged on the ground. And in the center, something that took my breath away: the same pile of papers I had seen in the room at the house. It was as if they had brought it there to wait for me. My legs trembled, and I felt like screaming, but I knew no one would hear me. I took a few steps back, trying to understand how this was possible, when I heard footsteps behind me. I slowly turned around and saw several people emerging from the shadows, one by one. They were the same guests from the party, but their faces looked different. There was something wrong with them: their eyes were deep set, their smiles stretched in an unnatural way. Clark was among them, with that same satisfied smile. "You shouldn't have looked at the papers, Mark," he said in a low, drawn-out voice. My mind was spinning, trying to find a way out, but I was surrounded. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt stiff, and my breathing was shallow, as if the very air had been drained. One by one, they began to approach, maintaining that distorted smile. Clark was the first to step forward, holding a piece of paper. When he unfolded it, I immediately recognized it. It was a photo of me, taken from the window of my apartment while I was watching TV. "You think you can run from what's always been with you?" he asked, and before I could answer, the lantern lights around us began to flicker. It was as if the very space around us was disintegrating. Then something happened that I'll never forget. The circle of lanterns went completely dark, and in the darkness, I felt cold hands grabbing me. But these weren't normal hands, they seemed to be made of shadow, like they were part of the darkness itself. A collective whisper echoed in my ear, saying things I couldn't understand. Suddenly, a bright light appeared out of nowhere, and everything around me disappeared. When I regained my sight, I was back on the road, alone, with my phone on the ground, still with no signal. There was no sign of Clark, the guests, or the lanterns. The only thing left was the photo he had been holding, now crumpled in my pocket, even though I didn't remember picking it up. After that night, I went home with my mind spinning, trying to process what had happened. I couldn't sleep. I spent hours staring at the photo that, somehow, had ended up in my pocket. It was too unsettling to think that someone had been so close to me, taking pictures of my life without me realizing it. The next morning, I went straight to the office, determined to confront Clark or at least figure out who he really was. But to my surprise, no one knew who I was talking about. I asked several people, even the manager, but everyone assured me there had never been anyone named Clark working there. To this day, I don't know exactly what happened that night. I've never been able to find the house again, even after driving to the area a few times. It was like the place had been erased from existence. I stopped getting strange messages, and my life seemed to return to normal. But sometimes, when I'm home alone, I feel like I'm being watched. Thor, my dog, often growls at the empty space as if something's there. And that photo. Well, I've never been able to get rid of it. Every time I try to throw it away, it shows up somewhere in my house. No matter how hard I try to forget, I feel like something from that night is still with me, waiting for the right moment to return.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've never been the type to get involved in trouble. I always had a simple routine, no big adventures or stories to tell. Back then, I was living in a small town upstate New York, working as a teacher at a local school. It was 2012, and on that particular night, I was coming back from a farewell dinner for a co-worker. It was well past 11, and I had about 25 miles to go before I got home. The road was one of those really deserted ones, surrounded by sugarcane fields with barely any streetlights. I've never liked driving at night, but there was no other option. Everything was fine until halfway down the road I saw something on the side. At first, it looked like just a shadow, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was standing there, thumb out, like he was hitchhiking. What was strange was that he seemed to be limping, and his face had this, I don't know how to describe it, a mix of desperation and emptiness. I thought about driving past, ignoring him, but I felt this tightness in my chest. What if he really needed help? I slowed down, and as I got closer, he made a motion with his hand, almost begging. It was risky, I knew, but something in his expression made me stop. I rolled down the window and asked if he needed help. His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper, like he was struggling to speak. He said he had gotten lost and needed to get to the nearest town. There was something about him that unsettled me, but at the same time, he didn't seem threatening. He was dirty, wearing a worn leather jacket and heavy pants that looked like they belonged in an old movie. There was something in his eyes, a distant look, like he was seeing something I couldn't. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and let him in. As soon as he sat down, I noticed this strange smell, something like rust and wet earth. I tried to make small talk to lighten the mood, asking where he was from and how he ended up here. He answered vaguely, saying only, "From far, really far." I felt a chill run down my spine, but decided not to press it. He sat in silence for a while, staring out the window, and that's when I noticed something weird. He wasn't looking at the road or the horizon. It was like he was staring at something that wasn't there. As we drove on, I started to feel like the atmosphere around us had shifted. The streetlights seemed dimmer, almost non-existent, and the radio, which had been playing some random station, began to crackle. My heart started racing, but I tried to stay calm. I mentioned it was cold and asked if he wanted me to turn on the heater. He slowly turned his head toward me and, with a small smile, said, "It won't make a difference." That sentence echoed in my mind, and I instantly regretted letting him in the car. I glanced at him again and noticed something I hadn't before. The sleeves of his jacket were faded, like they'd been washed hundreds of times, but it wasn't just that. There was a tear at the elbow, and underneath, it looked like there was something other than skin. It was dark, almost black, like old leather. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was nothing. When I tried to change the subject, asking if he had any family around here, he just said, "I used to, but they're not here anymore." Those words stayed with me. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. There was this deep sadness mixed with something I couldn't quite place. I kept driving, trying to ignore the unease, but I started noticing other strange things. He didn't move his hands much, but when he did, I saw that his fingers had deep cuts, like he'd been handling something sharp for hours. His nails were broken, but clean, which didn't make sense for someone who looked like him. At some point, he started talking, but it didn't make any sense. He said things like, "They always come back," or, "Have you seen the other side?" I was trying to keep it together, but every time he spoke, it felt like the air in the car grew heavier. The worst part was when, out of nowhere, he said, "You should have locked the door." My stomach froze. What did he mean by that? I tried to cover up my fear, laughing awkwardly and saying something like, "Why? Are you planning to rob me?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring out the window, murmuring things I couldn't understand. We reached a part of the road where there was a small gas station. I was sweating cold, and I decided to stop, pretending I needed to fuel up. I parked near the convenience store and said I was going to grab some water. He didn't respond, but his eyes followed me as I got out of the car. The store was empty, and the gas station attendant didn't seem to care much about my presence. I grabbed a bottle of water and went to the counter. As I was paying, I looked out the window at the car. He wasn't there anymore. I ran back to the car, my heart pounding. The passenger door was open, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I called out for him, looked around, but it was like he had never existed. Even the weird smell was gone. I got in the car, trembling, and started the engine. Before I left, I decided to check the seat where he had been sitting. That's when I found something that sent chills through me. An old coin, stained with dried blood. I didn't recognize the symbol on it, but it looked handmade, with rough details and an inscription in a language I'd never seen before. I sped off, my heart racing so fast it felt like it was echoing in the car. I tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe he had gotten out while I was distracted at the gas station. Maybe he was a homeless person who just didn't want to be found. But something didn't add up. The coin in my hand was cold and heavy, like it carried a story I could never understand. When I ran my fingers over the inscription, I felt a slight tingling, like something barely noticeable was connecting me to that object. The road seemed longer than it should have been, and the streetlights, which had been spaced out before, were now completely off. The radio crackled again, and at one point, a loud static made me almost lose control of the wheel. I looked in the rearview mirror, out of reflex, and I swear I saw a shadow in the darkness. It looked like the man, but the outline was wrong, like a distorted, misshapen figure. My whole body froze. I didn't know if I was imagining things or if it was really happening, but at that moment, I just wanted to get home. Finally, I saw the lights of my town appear on the horizon, but the sense of relief was brief. As I crossed the bridge that led to the center, I heard a sound coming from the back seat. It was a low sound, like a sigh, but enough to make my spine freeze. I looked in the rearview mirror again, afraid to confirm what I already felt. For a second, I thought I saw something moving in the darkness of the back seat, but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. I got home shaking, parked the car, and ran inside without looking back. I locked all the doors and windows, but that coin wouldn't leave my mind. I placed it on the kitchen table and sat down, trying to take deep breaths. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The coin was damp. It was dripping a dark liquid that I knew wasn't water. I grabbed a napkin to clean it, but the moment I touched it, a rush of intense cold ran up my arm, like something was trying to pull me to a place far, far away. I dropped the coin instantly and just stared at it, frozen. The dark liquid disappeared before my eyes, as if it had never been there. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. It was then, in the absolute silence of the house, that I heard 3 knocks on the front door. They weren't ordinary knocks. They were strong, deliberate, like whoever was out there wanted to make sure I heard them. I couldn't move. I felt the same strange smell from before, the mix of rust and wet earth, fill the air again. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. The knocks, however, kept going, now more persistent. I decided to open the door, certain that I needed to end it once and for all. But when I opened it, all I found was the emptiness of the night. On the ground, right at the doorstep, was another coin identical to the one I had found in the car. The cold sensation hit me again, and in that moment I knew. It wasn't over. I slammed the door shut, and that same night I burned the coins on the stove. I don't know if it worked, but I never saw them again, and I also never drove down that road at night again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
It was 2018, and my life revolved around college assignments, sleepless nights, and a routine shared with my friend Lucas, with whom I lived in a tiny apartment. Back then, our Friday nights always ended the same way, sitting at some bar downtown, chatting about whatever distracted us from the stress of exams. That night, after a few beers and laughs, we decided to walk home. It was a route we knew well, but Lucas, always curious and impulsive, suggested cutting through a street we'd never explored. "It'll be quicker," he said, already starting to walk. I followed, thinking it would just be another regular walk. The street felt like it had a life of its own. Unlike what we were used to downtown, there was no one around, not even the distant sound of cars or voices. The houses were old, with peeling facades and shut windows, as if their inhabitants had long been oblivious to what was happening outside. The streetlights were dim, and the cold wind cut through the air, carrying the smell of wet earth, even though it hadn't rained. We were halfway down the block when something caught our attention. A large house, ridiculously bright, stood out from everything else. Loud music spilled out through the windows, along with laughter and the clinking of glasses. It was a party, but not just any party. It felt like one of those scenes from old movies, with red curtains and a warm glow that made everything around it look darker. Lucas stopped and looked at me with a curious smile. "What do you think's going on in there?" he asked, as if it was impossible not to want to find out. We approached slowly, more out of curiosity than anything else. The closer we got, the more out of place the house seemed in the whole scene. The windows were tall, with detailed stained glass that shimmered as if reflecting candlelight from inside. The music was almost hypnotic, jazz that felt like it was from another time, and the voices and laughter echoing seemed to belong to a group of extremely excited people. Lucas was the first to climb the steps to the entrance. "Let's just take a look," he said, as if he needed to justify his own curiosity. When we reached the door, it suddenly opened, without anyone touching it. A man appeared, standing there, as if he had been waiting for us. He was tall, thin, and wore a spotless black suit, with an embroidered handkerchief in his pocket that seemed to shimmer under the porch light. His eyes, however, were what drew the most attention, clear and deep, but with something odd, like he didn't blink enough. Before we could say anything, he raised his hand in a gesture that made us stop instantly. "You shouldn't be here," he said, with a firm yet calm voice, almost like a warning. Lucas tried to argue, asking what was going on, but the man simply shook his head and repeated, "Go back home." His tone was so definitive that, for a moment, neither of us could react. Something in his gaze made it seem like this wasn't a suggestion, but an order. Lucas and I looked at each other, confused but also a little scared. The man stood still at the door, staring at us without moving an inch. For some reason, I felt a strange chill run down my spine, as if the air around us had gotten heavier. "Okay, fine, we're going," Lucas said, trying to sound casual, but I noticed he was avoiding looking directly at the man. As we started to walk away, the door slowly closed, almost silently, and the porch lights began to flicker. I looked back one last time and saw that, through the window, the party was still going on. People were laughing, toasting, and dancing, completely oblivious to what had just happened. It was surreal, like we were watching a scene from another world. On the way back, the silence of the street felt even more oppressive. Neither of us said anything for several minutes until Lucas finally broke the silence. "Did you see the way he looked at us?" It was like he knew something. I nodded in agreement, still trying to process what had happened. Something about that house didn't make sense. It wasn't just the man, or how the party felt so out of place in the rest of the neighborhood. It was the whole thing, like the house didn't belong there. When we got back to the apartment, Lucas tried to brush it off, saying maybe it was just a themed party or something, but I knew he was also trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that all of that had left behind. The next day, I woke up with that strange feeling still hanging over me. Lucas was already in the living room, with his laptop open and a coffee in his hand. I was thinking about that house from last night, he said, without taking his eyes off the screen. I think it was on that street we cut through, right? He had marked the route on Google Maps, and the idea was simple: go back to figure it out. Despite hesitating, curiosity got the better of me. As soon as we finished getting ready, we headed towards the street. Everything seemed the same as the night before: the old houses, the eerie silence, even the cold wind that seemed to follow us. But when we got to the spot where the house should have been, it simply wasn't there. In its place, there was just an empty lot, surrounded by a low wall covered in moss. We stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. Lucas pointed to the ground, where marks on the pavement suggested there might have once been a driveway. See that? I'm not crazy. There was a house here yesterday. I nodded, but doubts started creeping in. Had the loud music and the lights been our imagination? Or worse, had we stumbled into some kind of elaborate prank? We decided to knock on the door of the nearest house, a simple building with faded paint. An elderly woman opened the door, and when we asked about the house from the night before, she frowned, as if we were talking about something impossible. That house was demolished over 20 years ago, she said, as if it was obvious. Lucas and I exchanged glances, not knowing how to respond. We left without saying much, both of us with that knot in our stomachs that only shows up when something just doesn't fit. Lucas, always the more skeptical one, tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe we confused the block, he suggested, but the conviction in his voice was weakening. I knew he was just as confused as I was. We decided to walk a little further, trying to find something that could explain what we had seen. We went back to Google Maps, retraced the route from the night before, and still, nothing. The street was there, the houses too, but the mansion, it was like it had never existed. The emptiness that was left in its place was almost more disturbing than the sight of the party the night before. Things got even stranger when we stopped at a bakery on the corner to ask if anyone there knew anything about the house. The attendant, a friendly older man, listened to us carefully, but when we described the mansion and the party, he suddenly grew serious. You're not talking about the house on Magnolia Street, are you? He looked around, as if he wanted to make sure no one else was listening. They say sometimes it shows up, but it's not a real house. My grandmother used to tell me that in the 60s, a Christmas party there ended in tragedy. Everyone died in a fire, and to this day, they say the place reappears to lure in curious people. I laughed, a bit awkwardly, hoping Lucas would do the same, but he was pale, staring at the attendant as if he were trying to absorb those words. We left the bakery not knowing exactly what to think. Lucas, who usually always had a joke ready, was silent. We walked in silence for a few blocks, until he finally said, "Do you think he was serious?" I didn't know how to respond. The idea that we had seen something that shouldn't have been there was terrifying, but it made more sense than any other explanation I could come up with. Everything that had happened the night before seemed even more absurd now: the music, the lights, that strange man who warned us not to go in. If what the attendant said was true, then we had escaped something much worse than we had imagined. Back at the apartment, Lucas started researching the house's history. He found some old news articles, but nothing too specific. Most mentioned a fire in a mansion that really was on that street, but the dates and details varied. In some accounts, they talked about a short circuit during a Christmas party. In others, they mentioned a man who locked everyone inside before setting the house on fire. The only consistent thing in all the stories was that no one survived. "Man, this is crazy," Lucas said, closing the laptop with a sigh. "If what we saw last night was real, then what did it want with us?" I didn't have an answer, but that question haunted me. In the following days, we avoided talking about it, but it was clear that it was bothering us. Every time I walked by the living room and saw Lucas staring at his laptop or scribbling in a notebook, I knew he was trying to piece things together. I, on the other hand, didn't want to know anymore. The more I thought about it, the more real everything felt, and that was what scared me. One night, while I was trying to watch something on TV to distract my mind, Lucas came into the room with a serious expression. "I dreamt about the house," he said, sitting down on the couch next to me. Before I could ask, he continued, the party, the man at the door, it was all there. But in the dream, he didn't tell us to leave. He asked me to come in. His words made me freeze. Lucas had always been the most skeptical one between us, the guy who never believed in anything supernatural. But that night, he looked genuinely scared. Did you go in? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He shook his head. I woke up before. But it felt so real that I can still smell the place. After that, we decided it was better to leave it behind. Stop looking for answers and get on with our lives. But something inside me knew it wouldn't be that simple. Every time I passed near that street, I felt a chill, as if the house was still there, waiting, just invisible to the eyes. To this day, when I tell this story, some people laugh, others get scared, but no one truly believes it. Maybe I don't even believe it.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.